Hi all, thank you for joining us in our 2024 complimentary webinar series covering the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations. We're coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. Thank you for being here. Okay, so just a little bit about the series. As usual, all of our webinars are complimentary and recorded. The FAR has 52 total parts, and we're going to run through them sequentially each week on Wednesdays and Fridays at noon Eastern Time. And the recordings and the PowerPoints will be posted within 24 hours of the webinar ending. You can find the recordings on our YouTube channel simply by subscribing to it using the link you see on the screen, and there's no cost for this. But you can also find the PowerPoint on the SlideShare site using your LinkedIn credentials to log in, and there's no cost for this either. We also offer sponsorship opportunities, so if you're interested in that, please shoot us an email to hello@jenniferschaus.com, and you can also see that email at the bottom of the screen. And now how to sign up for the series. Unfortunately, there's no bulk registration, so you do have to register individually for each webinar. If you go to the Jennifer Schaus website and navigate to the section called the FAR, and you'll find the individual registration links there, and also the recording links will be posted here upon completion of each webinar. So you can find today's webinar in that tab as well. Please note that we covered the FAR in 2020, so if you're eager to get a jump start, you can find these historical recordings on our website if you navigate to the webinars tab and scroll down to the section, the FAR 2020. But just because it has been 4 years, many of the regulations have changed and been updated, so please use us as a reference tool only. Just a little bit about us. We work with established federal contractors worldwide, helping them to navigate the market. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance, and some of the contract vehicles we support are listed here on your screen. For more information, you can visit our website. Those were our services for federal contractors. We also provide marketing and advertising services for organizations who are selling to federal contractors. We can add some extra muscle to your marketing efforts via our newsletter ads and webinar sponsorships to in-person events. Please email us and ask for our media kit, and that email can again be found in the bottom of your screen. We're currently offering a spring special with discounted rates, more specifically a buy one, get one for our newsletter. Ads will run for 13 weeks, so please email us if you have any questions on that or if you want a quote. Contract vehicles can be a great tool for pursuing federal business. Current open solicitations include Navy Seaport, Next Generation, and NASA SEWP, as well as GSA Alliant. Additionally, the GSA Multiple Award Schedule is an open and rolling RFP. So if you qualify for any of these and you need proposal support, please email us for a quote at hello@jenniferschaus.com. As you know, congressional hearings on both the House of Representatives and on the Senate side are open to the public unless otherwise stated. And we have a list here of the upcoming schedule, including the date, time, buildings, and room numbers. Most meetings take place in the Dirksen, Rayburn, or Cannon buildings. So if you're selling to any of these departments or agencies, attending the hearings can be a great way to gather information, understand the process, and also network with influencers. Jennifer is going to be teaching in these upcoming webinars for Michigan Apex Accelerator, so please join us for these educational webinars. They're complimentary, and we hope to see you there. Registration links are in our newsletter, and you can email us to get the link as well. Additionally, Jennifer is going to cover GSA schedules as well as federal marketing for our local Apex Accelerator in Virginia, and these are complimentary and online webinars, so please join us for that as well. Coming up in June, we're going to hear from Carrie Palmatier on small business innovation and federal contracting. Specifically, Carrie is going to cover information on SBIRs and STTRs. These two options are a great way for tech companies to grow in the federal sector, and this is a two-part series. And as always, these are recorded and complimentary. Our webinars are complimentary thanks to our longtime and generous corporate sponsors and in-kind sponsors, so please allow me to introduce them. We'd like to thank our friends at GovEvents, the premier platform for posting events related to government and government contracting. You can find all of our events and our webinars on govevents.com, as well as recordings from our past 600+ webinars. We also want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert, the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for small, women-owned, veteran-owned, hub zone, and 8A firms. You can visit setasidealert.com for more information on that. The Fairfax Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars, and we want to thank them for posting our events and webinars on their calendar. The Virginia Apex Accelerator at George Mason University offers free one-on-one counseling to established government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore their services, review homework recommendations, register for live trainings, and find useful links to agencies and other self-directed learnings there. One-on-one counseling is limited to eligible client companies, and appointment requests are handled in the order they're received and based on counselor availability due to high demand. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. Join the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce's monthly GovCon Council meeting to network with peers, learn about upcoming events and opportunities, and help to shape future programming. The meetings take place on the fourth Tuesday of each month at 8:30 a.m. at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce, and the next meeting is going to be on Tuesday, May 28th from 8:30 to 9:30. Do you want help winning government contracts? BidSpeed can help. Users can find contract opportunities from federal, state, and local government. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contact, expiring contracts, compliance matrices, and also proposal templates. Create your login at bidspeed.com. BidSpeed is an official partner of the U.S. Small Business Administration's E2G Empower to Grow program. Events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel report that they attend more than one event each year, and the Federal Business Council, or FBC, has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government agency achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity symposiums, technology expos, and offsite meetings. FBC provides full lifecycle meeting planning and event management. With over 5,000 meetings under their belt, FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at www.fbcinc.com. Please also check out our friends over at GovBrew. GovBrew is the most read GovCon newsletter, keeping thousands of GovCon professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal contracting market. All in a fun, accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read, and it's 100% free to join. It goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m., and it's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. We encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on the screen. Okay. Now let's meet today's speakers. Please welcome Abby Salinas to the webinar. Abby, we're honored to have you with us today, and we're so excited to hear a presentation on the FAR. We'd also like to welcome Stephen Weber. Stephen, thank you for being with us today. Again, we're excited to hear your presentation. We really appreciate the time you took to put together the content. And Abby and Stephen, I'll now put myself on mute and turn the floor over to you. Please let me know when you're ready for your next slide, and I'll advance them as we discussed.
All right, thank you for that introduction. As she said, my name is Abby Bella Salinas. I'm an associate here in Picard & Abramson's Washington, D.C. office, and we represent construction contractors at all levels doing federal contracting work with several different agencies. So next slide. So let's start by talking about why it's important for government contractors to understand this part of the FAR and to become familiar with it. And that is that before awarding a contract, a contracting officer is going to have to ensure that the contractor is what is called a responsible contractor. So that means that the government's going to be judging whether the contractor has the means and the ability to complete the contract that's in question. That's going to consider, they're going to consider several different factors in that determination. It's going to be everything from your ability to meet a schedule, your performance record, your experience doing similar contracts or work in a similar area. It's also going to take account your record of integrity, business ethics, and compliance with any such regulations. But what we're talking about today is that it's going to take into account whether you have adequate financial resources to perform the contract or you have the ability to obtain those resources. So if we look to FAR 91043, it states that the contracting officer needs to require acceptable evidence of the prospective contractor's ability to obtain resources. And that's going to normally consist of a commitment or an explicit arrangement that will be in existence at the time of the contract award to rent, to purchase, or to otherwise acquire the needed facilities, equipment, resources, or personnel. So it is a pretty far-reaching and wide question that they're asking here. Can you afford to do this contract, and where are you going to get the money? Next slide. As I said, it's going to be a pretty far-reaching part of the FAR. So here I'm going to start with an introduction as to the several different parts that we're going to talk about today. Beginning with project payments, the FAR covers several different methods and processes for contractors to receive payments. There are three main methods. That's going to be the percentage or stage of completion method, where you're receiving payments based on completing 20% of the work, 50% of the work, etc. Then there's going to be cost-based payments for contractors as work progresses. So those are going to be based on cost milestones, say every $1 million, every $10 million, etc. And then the third is going to be the preferred method, which is the performance-based payment system. In that method, payments come after the meeting of an objective or an event or another quantifiable result along the schedule of the project. Next is loan guarantees and advance payments. So loan guarantees are generally going to be Federal Reserve Bank guarantee loans that are made on behalf of a guaranteeing agency, and that's going to enable contractors to obtain financing from private sources for national defense contracts. Advance payments are going to be advances by the government that are made to the prime contractor for the purpose of completing performance. And so those are going to be liquidated from payments that are due to the contractor for work performed, and they can often be made for the purpose of the prime making further advances to the subcontractors. And then debts to the government, contract funding, and private financing, we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth as we move forward in our presentation. Next slide. So debts to the government. The first question we often get in this area is how would I even incur a debt to the government? And there are several ways. So one way is going to be if there's a price redetermination or something, or some sort of determination of prices under an incentive type contract, and that's going to result in a billing or a price reduction that is going to look like a debt to the government. It can also come from financing payments that are made in excess of contract limitations, or if there are any duplicate or erroneous payments made, such as if a double invoicing mistake gets paid both times, if there's an increase to a financing payment liquidation rate, if there is a price adjustment that results from any sort of non-compliance, if your contract is going to be subject to the cost accounting standards and there is non-compliance in that, that could result in a price adjustment that leads to a contractor owing money to the government. And then there's also going to be debts that are owed when the contractor performs work that is not up to par with what is required in the contract. So if there are reinspection costs for anything that is non-conforming, or if there are damages or excess costs related to those defaults in performance, that could lead to a debt to the government. And then the last place where we see these is going to be if there is reimbursement of costs where a post-award protest is sustained because the initial awardee either initially or negligently misstated, misrepresented, or miscertified something in their bid, and that leads to the government having to re-award the work, and the costs associated with that are going to have to be paid by that initial offer who made the mistake or who was negligent. So when you owe a debt to the government, the first step is going to be a government determination that the debt is due, including the amount owed. So this is an official determination made by the agency. The next step is going to be a contracting officer issuing a demand for payment based on that determination. So that demand for payment is going to still be issued even if the debt is or will be subject to a bilateral modification. So if you're already in conversations with the agency, they may still issue that demand for payment. It will still be issued if the contractor is otherwise obligated to pay the money under some clause in the contract. They are still going to issue that demand for payment. And they are also still going to issue it if you've already informally agreed. So again, if you're in talks with the agency regarding the debt that you know that you owe, they are still going to issue that demand for payment, even if you're in informal conversations where you've agreed, hey, I know I need to pay this and I'm going to pay it in this manner. So once that demand for payment is issued, the contractor is going to have 30 days to pay the debt, and after that, interest will begin to accrue on that debt. Next slide. Some other considerations to think about when you may owe a debt to the government is that the agency can offset that debt against payments that are otherwise due to the contractor. So if you're still moving forward with the contract and you owe a debt to the government, they can reduce your future payments from because of the debt that you owe. So that's generally going to occur if you receive that demand for payment and you do not make that full payment within 30 days of the due date stated on that demand. Also consider that the debt may be subject to administrative charges, so the debt in itself is not the only cost that is going to have to be remitted to the government. There are also going to be administrative charges associated with that debt. To deal with this, the contractor can submit a request for installment payments or a request for a deferment if it's not practicable or if the amount is somehow disputed. So payment plans are going to include a specific schedule of plan for payment, and they're going to permit the government to make periodic financial reviews of the contractor, and the government will be able to require earlier payments if they consider that the contractor's ability to pay has somehow improved. Requests for deferment must be submitted in writing. There is a specific list of requirements that's found in FAR 32.607. It's a pretty extensive list that you need to make sure that you're including all of those things if you make a request for deferment. The last consideration is going to be that debts that are delinquent over 180 days are transferred from the agency to the Department of the Treasury for collection. And at that point, you are no longer going to be speaking directly to the agency that you've been having communications with. It would be transferred to the Department of the Treasury. Next slide. The contracting officer is going to issue a final decision on any debt owed to the government if the parties are unable to reach an agreement on either the existence of the debt at all or the amount of the debt in a timely manner. They'll also issue a final decision if the contractor fails to liquidate a debt that was previously demanded, again within that timeline specified in the demand for payment. And lastly, they're going to issue that final decision if the contractor requests a deferment of collection. So that final decision will be appealable. And I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to Stephen Weber. Next slide.
Thanks, Abby. And what Abby just went through was a very detailed stage setting kind of exercise to try to demonstrate the situations in which these considerations are applicable. One important thing to remember is you're generally only going to see them in fixed price contracts. These kind of situations don't commonly occur in other kinds of contracts for reasons that will become apparent as we go through. But just to give you, and there's a million different factual scenarios under which this could arise, but here's an easy one to think of. A company bids and gets an award of a contract, and in order to perform that contract, they need to hire new personnel, they need to procure new equipment, they need to train those people. So there's a lot of upfront costs that the contractor will incur, but they're not otherwise invoiceable under the contract. And so a lot of the considerations that we're going to talk about are ways that the government can fund the contractor, even though there's no basis under the billing procedures at that particular point in time to make them entitled to receive any interim payments. And the other consideration is, and I'll just use arbitrary dates, but to give you an idea of the impact on the contractor, let's take a contract that performance starts or preparation for performance starts on May 1st and costs are incurred on that date. In our hypothetical, either procuring new people or procuring new equipment. The contractor's got an actual real cost there that is not capable of being recovered immediately, even if it is something that can be charged under the contract. Most contracts will require progress payment applications to be submitted on a monthly basis, so it won't be until the end of May at the earliest that the contractor can start invoicing for costs incurred in the very beginning of the same month of May, and then the government typically will have 30 days to review and pay those invoices. So by the time the payment actually comes in, the contractor's got carrying costs, some of which are up to 60 days plus. And so these kind of situations sometimes require a different kind of funding mechanism to enable the contractor to get more real-time reimbursed for the costs it's incurring. One particular example that we see all the time on major construction projects are a mobilization charge. So when a contractor comes to begin performance on a new project, it's got to mobilize people, it's got to set up offices, usually in the form of trailers that are either owned or rented. They have to get the proper equipment on site, they have to get the personnel on site, and whatever preparatory work needs to be done before they can start executing the contract. All of that needs to be done up front. And the way to cover those incredible costs to the contractor in a timely manner is to set up in the contract a mechanism to allow the contractor to invoice for mobilization. And it's usually a fixed fee, but it's close to or sufficient to cover those advanced costs that are being expended, so the contractor can then initiate the performance on the contract. So those are kind of the factual scenarios that we see these kind of things coming up, and now we're going to walk through a little bit more detail on some of the financing rules that are in play when the government and the contractor are in situations requiring some kind of advanced payments. There is on this slide a number of different possibilities that would qualify as advanced payments or contract financing. Advanced payments being one of them. There can be performance-based payments, contractors hitting certain milestones up front. The mobilization example is one possibility, although there can be an infinite number depending on the creativity and the willingness of the government to work with the contractor. There are progress payments that are allowable under FAR Part 52, 232.16, and I'm not going to take you through all of those, but it's another vehicle that recognizes the propriety of progress payments in certain situations. And so on construction projects, rather than invoice for costs incurred by the contractor on a typical fixed fee contract, what will normally happen is that the parties will meet, the government representatives and the contractor, they'll meet shortly in advance of the time where the monthly invoice would be going in, and they'll walk the job and they'll sort of negotiate percent complete for a variety of items, which then carry prices in a schedule of values, and they will hopefully agree on the percent complete, which will tell the contractor what they can invoice for at that time. It's not tied to the contractor's expenditure of money. It's not necessarily tied to the materials that have been received on site. It's just an overall for different discrete portions of the work or different divisions like electrical or mechanical. They will go through and agree on a percent complete, which will define the proper amount that can be invoiced ultimately under this particular pay application. And they will do that on a recurring basis, monthly basis, and that will set the stage for what the contractor gets paid. But again, it can be considered a form of financing in that it is not tied to the contractor's costs. The government may be paying monies that it wouldn't otherwise be due under a different kind of payment mechanism, but nevertheless, for purposes of these kind of projects, it works out fine. It's expeditious, and it kind of helps the process run smoothly and get the contractor paid on a timely basis. Obviously, at the end of the job, it all works out the same one way or the other. And then another example listed here are interim payments under cost reimbursement contracts, except when this particular alternate of this FAR provision is used, again, too specific and off point for this, the scope of this particular presentation. So if you could move to the next slide, please. And again, so certain kinds of contract financing, there's actually an order of precedence that the government uses to determine which are allowable or not allowable in its discretion. And the kind of project financing it has the least problem with is without any kind of government guarantee. So a loan from a bank, for example, that the contractor is able to procure, the government doesn't usually have problems with that. And there are certain other descending levels of things, just pure voluntary advance payments and unusual contract financing are two vehicles that the government is not all that particularly excited about having to rely on, and it requires a lot of time and paperwork to get those through. But they are available, and the government does have some ability to be somewhat creative if the situation warrants that. But these contract financing payments, so things that we talked about, what's included, things that do not fall under this definition, invoice payments, so payments for partial deliveries, those are actually work performed, work in place, and there's typically a contract provision that will allow the contractor to invoice a certain amount for a portion of material sent to the project site, covered in the scope of the project, but not installed. They'll just sit on site until all of them are there, or the project advances to the stage where the installation of those materials is required. So the government's payment for partial deliveries is not something that falls under this umbrella of contract financing. Final cost or fee payments where the amounts have been settled, again, not under this definition. Payments made under fixed price payment clause, like we just talked about, also not part of project financing. And interim payments under a cost reimbursement contract, where again, this alternate FAR provision is used. These things are not considered to be examples of invoice payments and not considered to be contract finance payments. In addition, payments for partial deliveries, which we covered, and lease and rental payments are also not under the definition of contract financing. And then there are a few other loopholes and limited applications that fall under this rule, but we're generally not talking about those kind of situations as we go through these rules. So in the law concept of forming a binding contract, there must be consideration that flows from each party to the other party. And so these situations where they come up and a contractor finds itself partially performed on the job and gets into a bind where it needs financing from the government. The government cannot just change the payment terms of the contract without receiving some consideration in return. And this is true whether it's done at the initial stage before the contract is even entered into, or if a change needs to be made during the course of performance. There will need to be some consideration to the government for the risk it takes on by being involved in one of these financing situations. So one form of that kind, I'm sorry, can you flip us to the next slide, please? Perfect. So one form of the consideration that contractors may be required to provide in exchange for the government's financing involvement is that the price will be lower. So the government would need some consideration in the form of a lower contract price than it would otherwise be were the project not subject to financial and financing terms. The contract terms and conditions would be more beneficial to the government. For example, the amount of liquidated damages may be increased, and they can take on a number of settings, but there must be something that the contractor is giving up to receive the benefit of getting financing where none was anticipated or if none were needed. So those are a couple of them. And if during the project we have a change in circumstance and that the balance of the project must be subject to these financing considerations, at that point in time, a bilateral modification between the contractor and the government will need to be signed. And as part of that modification, the contractor will have to provide similar type of consideration in exchange for the government amending the payment terms of the contract. And there are some considerations in this process that the contracting officer should look at, such as the value to the contractor of the anticipated amount and duration of the contract financing, and the imputed financial costs of the equivalent working capital. So they're doing some kind of interest analysis, and stated in oversimplified terms, to see what the benefit is to the contractor, and the consideration the contractor is asked to provide to the government in exchange is likely to include some or all of that interest savings by not having to go out and borrow from a commercial institution, and the estimated profit rate to be earned by the contractor during performance. So these are some of the areas the contracting officer should consider as they look at whether or not to accept a contractor proposal that involves financing in some way. Next slide, please. Now, all of these things are applicable to projects that are domestically performed within the four corners of the US, but the US government has interests all over the world, and they enter contracts all over the world for goods and services, including construction, everywhere in the world, and the considerations of those projects are not exactly the same as they are domestically. In this area of contract financing, there's a few extra things to be careful of and to look at. The enforceability of the government financing may be dependent on local law and procedure, so you may have to involve an attorney in whatever jurisdiction the work is being performed. For example, if the US government is doing work on one of its base installations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Romania, or anywhere else in the world, because they're all over the place, one thing that would need to be looked at if financing is going to be part of that is what does the local law in the host country say about these kind of deals or obligations by the government. And you must pass both tests, the considerations we're talking about here, but in addition, an extra layer of being able to satisfy local law at the same time. And there may be different security provision requirements than would be standard. So there are a few things to look at if you're talking about a US government contract being performed overseas. Next slide, please. Another type of consideration that's available to the government as they're trying to help contractors through these financing situations. A lot of this defined in this FAR provision 23240, but some of the main topics, first of all, these accelerated payments are when the government is paying for work ahead of when it is required to pay for work under the contract. And that can take a number of different forms, but it is not available on Department of Defense projects. So that's one easy consideration. You see it most prominently in areas where a small business has contracted with the government, or a prime contractor, non-small prime contractor that has small subcontractors, and the financing situation on the project otherwise so dictates. There may be an availability for accelerated payments. And if we're looking at progress payments, this is merely a situation where the government will pay faster than it's otherwise required to pay by law. In these situations, the payments are expected in 15 days rather than the normal 30 required of the Prompt Payment Act, which we will come to later in this presentation. But they basically shorten the turnaround time for the release of funds to 15 days as opposed to 30 days. And it's important to also understand that this is separate and distinct from the Prompt Payment Act. The Prompt Payment Act has certain interest penalties, for lack of a better term, to the government if they pay late. Those penalties and those considerations are not applicable when you're in a situation of accelerated payments. It's more like we promise to do our best to pay you within 15 days, but if we don't, we're not liable for interest on late payments until, of course, the 30-day requirement in the Prompt Payment Act is triggered. So it doesn't establish a new liability on the government, just basically a helping hand that they agree to do. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of other limitations on when the government can sort of assist contractors with financing. There are two clauses, the limitation of cost, limitation of funds clause, and they have definitions in them which restrict when the government can or cannot spend money, and there are limits on when the government can spend money. One of them, and I guess all of them are ultimately rooted in what is called the Anti-Deficiency Act, and in its simplest concept, the Anti-Deficiency Act says that the US government cannot obligate money that hasn't been allocated to a given purchase. So there's no credit card at the feds. They pay as they go. So if a project has a certain amount of funding allocated to it, the government cannot spend in excess of the amount allocated. There would have to be a separate revenue stream as part of the next fiscal year budgeting process that would provide the funding necessary to pick up the additional unanticipated costs that are over and above the contract limitations, which sometimes puts the government in a real bind. It's seen this a number of times. It's even more prevalent on foreign projects. The project, for whatever reason, design deficiencies or whatever, will result in change orders needing to be issued to the contractor, which will increase the amount of payments required to be made to the contractor as the project goes along. And at that point, at some point, they simply sort of run out of money, and hopefully they do it in a way with some foresight, but there are decisions that have to be made when the funding isn't there to complete the contract, pay a claim, pay a change, and you'll see the government sometimes even slow playing these processes to try to stall into the next fiscal year in the hopes that the next fiscal budget will include funds that can be allocated and appropriated to cover the cost overruns on their projects. So they'll issue a suspension of work to the contractor, tell them to stop working, and they'll ask for proposals. How much would it cost to send you home and bring you back in 6 months or 8 months? How much would it cost if we just had you stay here, or stay here with a skeleton crew, or stay here with just your key personnel? And the contractor will have to go through the process of providing prices for all these different scenarios so the government can figure out which one it wants to enter into and fit into the shoehorn of how much money they have left. None of these proposals, by the way, are reimbursable to the contractors, so they're getting a bunch of free work out of the contractor in an effort to justify their own failure to be able to pay them. So it's a kind of a difficult situation, and it is because it is prescribed by law that the government cannot spend money that has not been appropriated and assigned or obligated to a particular project. And there is also civil and criminal penalties to members of the government for encouraging a contractor to continue to work in the absence of funds. So you can't knowingly make the contractor do a bunch of work, and then when you get invoiced for it, say, oh God, we're out of money, sorry, and get away with not paying them. There's not only penalties, commercial penalties for the project, but there's civil and potential criminal liability to the individuals involved in that kind of deceit. And the Justice Department has from time to time gone after folks for that. So there is some teeth to these rules that restrict the government's ability to spend money that they don't have. Next slide, please. So now we talk about situations where a contractor who has procured money from a third party, usually a bank loan, that's probably the easiest situation to think of this. If they are in a state where they are not able to make payments to repay the loan under the terms of the loan, sometimes there's a situation where the contract, in particular done for the receipts due under the contract, can be assigned to the lender to give them the influx of cash necessary to pay off the loan that they made. There's a bunch of limitations on this, and ultimately it involves government discretion, and they need to sign off on it as well. One of the things that folks commonly fail to look at in this situation is, does the contract between the original contractor and the government speak to this issue about whether or not a contract can be assigned? Usually it's thought of in terms of assigning the obligations to perform work to another party, but in these kind of financial settings, it's applicable in that the contract can be assigned to a lender to give them a basis to collect where the contractor is in or headed to bankruptcy, for example, or they're just financially not able to complete the terms of the loan of the money that came to them. So the government needs to sign off on any assignment of contracts of the prime contract typically, and it's up to the party receiving the assignment. In our hypothetical, that would be the bank or the lending institution. They are obligated to send written notice of the assignment, including a copy of the assignment interest. So what is the deal between the contractor and his bank? They have to send a copy of that to the government and also to the CO, the contracting officer, or the head of the agency. Any surety that might be involved in terms of issuing a performance bond, and the disbursing officer for the government making the payments. So everyone gets copied on this, and it seems like an onerous task for somebody taking an assignment, but it's better than not getting paid. And some of the task is made a little bit easier because FAR 32805C contains a suggested format for the notice of this assignment that this lending institution or assignee would have to provide that would be compliant with the notice requirements to make sure everybody's on board with this change in the parties to the deal. And there are a few other considerations and effects of such assignments. So we'll look at those on the next slide, please. First thing to remember is that an assignment of claims does not alter the relationship between the original contractor and the government. The assignee, the party getting the assignment, in our hypothetical, the bank, does not become a party to the contract, which has a lot of ramifications in terms of the rights they inherit. If the person to whom they loan money has an affirmative claim that hasn't been progressed yet, the assignee does not obtain the right to step into the shoes of the contractor and pursue that claim. It's different than a performance bond surety. The law on performance bond surety is that if their principal, the contractor, defaults, they can step into the shoes of the contractor and they assume the obligations to complete the project. And there are a number, we're not going to get into all of that, but there are a number of different options available to the surety. But they also, if they take over the project, inherit the rights and the obligations of the contractor, including the right to pursue affirmative claims against the government, because it's as if they were a party to the contract. A mere financial loan in the situation we're talking about is different, and it does not provide that level of relief to the lending institution. And also this assignee, this bank, is not in privity or not in contract with the government. It's not a Contract Disputes Act contractor as that term is defined in that statute, and it's not given the right, as I said, to assert claims under the Contract Disputes Act. And that case has been litigated a number of times. There are a couple of sites in here from 2011 and 2015, but it's pretty clear that the rights that a lending institution, for example, would have don't create obligations on the part of the government to satisfy terms of that financing instrument. Next slide, please. So there is also an immunity consideration that has to be examined. The government, and this is in terms of a government's right to set off or an affirmative claim of the government cannot recover money paid to the assignee. That's again, its original contract. I'm sorry, that's the lending institution. So they can't recover from the lending institution under a valid assignment when the contractor who assigned the payment owes money to the government. That's got to be taken care of at the initial stage when this assignment is agreed to by all the parties. If it's not taken care of then, there is no right of the government to pursue the lending institution for claims it has back against the contractor. They have to either do that commercially in terms of the deal that ultimately gets assigned, or in some other fashion, but their recourse is against the contractor and not the third-party lender. However, in terms of payments that it owes, it can still exercise rights of set-off to other kinds of debts like liquidated damages, reprocurement costs or excess reprocurement costs in the event of a default, government claims. So it's allowed to offset, but it cannot recover money. It defines, the government retains the right to reduce the amount of money it owes under valid contract clauses in terms of a construction project, but it can't affirmatively recover money which it might otherwise be able to recover against the contractor in the situation where there's a third-party lender that has gotten into this deal to finance part of the work of the contractor. Next slide, please. So we touched on this briefly during the course of this discussion, but the government is required under other provisions in the FAR and the 1982 Prompt Payment Act to pay contractors within 30 days of the receipt of a proper invoice. And that's based upon a good faith belief in the government that the invoice is proper. They can't use it arbitrarily to extend the start date on that 30-day period. And then this FAR provision cited in here, 52-232-27A2, lists a number of elements that must be included in an invoice for it to be considered proper. It's not that there can't be other pieces that are needed, but these are sort of the minimum elements where applicable that must be included. And for fixed price construction contracts in particular, progress payments are based on a stage of completion. The invoicing process must include backup documentation to substantiate the amounts requested, and those situations require a certification called for in FAR 52-232-5. There's an extra requirement because we're not dealing with things with price tags and receipts. We're dealing with stages of completion and work being performed in a satisfactory way. So the certification element is necessary. And one of the best things a contractor can do in these kind of projects is to get the agency's concurrence. There's a construction manager on board, whether it be a government construction manager or an outside representative, but somebody's overseeing the construction work and protecting the government's interest during performance. And the contractor's best defense, or the most protection it can afford itself, is to come to a negotiated agreement about percent complete of work installed with the government, so there is no question on whether or not the certification is creating any problems. If it's agreed to by the parties, then the contractor's got an automatic defense, if you will, to anybody saying you're overbilling. The government is required to return or notify the contractor of a defective invoice within 7 days of its receipt. If it does not do so, then it's deemed that the government has accepted it, and it is obligated to make payment in accordance with the terms of the Prompt Payment Act within 30 days, or face the possibility of interest being added to the amount of money due under the invoice. And so this is probably as good a time as any. The quantification of interest owed pursuant to the Prompt Payment Act and other areas of government contracts is dictated by statute. There's the Treasury Department publishes interest rates every 6 months, July and January, with a prescribed rate, and that defines the rate of interest the government must pay when it has to pay interest. It also serves as a calculator for contractors who submit claims to the government to be able to quantify an interest claim as part of those claims. And it's a somewhat tedious process, but if you look at, for example, progress payments, which are due 30 days after receipt, in theory, if there was a portion of every progress payment that did not get paid by the government, the contractor's ultimate interest claim, were it to prevail, would have to take the date of the invoice, add 30 days, and then run the prescribed rate to the applicable time frame for the duration of the lack of payment, which could be months or years if it ends up in a dispute and litigation. And it's simple interest, not compound. So that part of it is easy enough to do. You can't compound the interest every 6 months. It's got to be on the same base, which would be the quantification of the claim. And it's just the application of a different rate every 6 months. But you'd have to do that for, if the claim centers around unpaid invoices, you'd have to do that analysis for each and every one of those invoices, establish the date on which it's due, and run the interest from that day forward. So it's a bit of a tedious process, and it involves at least 2 calculations for every calendar year, including any partial years, and which have to be again prorated. So that is the rate at which the government is obligated to pay interest in the event of, for example, a dispute where it doesn't think it owes the contractor money and is judged to be wrong ultimately. It will have to pay interest on that money pursuant to the Prompt Payment Act at those statutory rates published by the Treasury Department. And the prompt payment interest does not accrue to a genuine bona fide dispute until the claim or the dispute is the subject of a certified claim from the contractor. That is the event that triggers the start of interest in a claim scenario, which is a little different. That's off project and a more formal dispute resolution kind of approach. But the certification, the date of the certification of the claim, is the date that starts the clock on interest moving forward on those kind of disputes.
Let's go to the next slide.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Abby. And this street runs both ways in that contractors can be liable for prompt payment interest if they are paid for non-conforming work and it's later determined the work is non-conforming, but they've already invoiced and been paid for it, but it doesn't get fixed until months down the road, then that the funds available to pay for that piece of work were paid prematurely by the government, and the government can include a claim to the contractor for the interest on the overpayment, if you will, for the amount of time that the overpayment was applicable up until the work is fixed. So it's important to know that contractors can be on either end of these kind of prompt payment interest quantifications. Let's go to the next slide, please. It's probably one of the last, if not the last concept we're taking care of here. Construction contracts typically provide for the government to be able to retain certain amount of progress payments that are due and owing to the contractor. These are called retainages because they are retaining a portion of the contractor's money. Defined by contract, maximum that they can retain is up to 10%, and they've got to be kind of geared toward protection of the government's interests. So in situations where the project is nearing completion, work's been installed, the government knows the work has been done in a workmanlike manner, it can't justify holding on a $30 million contract. It can't justify continuing to hold $3 million when it only needs $300,000 to protect its interest. So there are provisions sometimes in the contract, and typically what will happen is that a certain point in percent complete of a project will entitle the contractor to ask for a reduction in the retention from hypothetically 10% maybe to 5%. And there might be another step down to cut that in half at a later point in time. Ultimately, the idea is that the government should not be keeping the contractor's money for an extended period of time where the protection that it's built in to preserve is no longer necessary. And so the closer you get to completion, the better the contractor's argument for a reduction in the amount of retention. It's earned contract money by the contractor that's just been held by the government. So the government should be interested in making sure the contractor gets its money in a timely manner, as long as there is no exposure or liability on the government's part. And they must certainly pay any remaining retention promptly after completion of all of the requirements of the contract. So once final completion is attained and the government has the beneficial use of the facility it was building, certainly there is absolutely no reason that it shouldn't give the remaining retention back to the contractor in a timely manner. And an argument can be made perhaps even sooner than that, depending on how many punch list activities need to be performed until final completion is reached. And at that point, we've reached the end of our prepared materials, and thank you so much for your attention and interest.
Thank you to Stephen and Abby for joining us today and for your very informative presentation. And thanks to everybody who joined us today as well.
Thank you very much.
And then, as mentioned, you can always catch the recording on our YouTube channel within 24 hours and find over 600 webinars on government contracting there. And that's it for today's webinar. Thank you again, Abby, and thank you, Stephen, and thanks to everybody who joined us today. Have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend.